Right, so diffusion and cell membrane. So we will now be looking at diffusion actually taking place within a particular animal cell, for example. So they are saying that substances pass into and out of cell through what is known as the cell membrane. Now, looking at the image to the top, now the brown section is actually showing the cell membrane. Now, in the middle of it, you can actually see an opening. So that opening is actually showing a substance, whether entering or leaving the cell. Now, let's say, for example, the cell is surrounded by oxygen, and that oxygen need to go into the cell. Outside of the cell where you have a lot of oxygen will be the place of high concentration for the oxygen, because it is outside of the cell, and inside of the cell where there is small amount of oxygen, that would be actually the place of low concentration for the oxygen. So again, what we mean by high concentration, that is normal the area or the place where there is a lot of that particular substance or chemical, and the place of low concentration is where you basically have a small amount or a few. So the first pointer is saying substances pass into and out of the cell through the cell membrane. So I can definitely ask you a question: which cell component or which cell part allow substances to move in and out of the cell? And the answer for that should be the cell membrane. The second pointer, the cell membrane is like a barrier with thin pores or holes in it. So, in terms of the oxygen going across, in terms of some nutrients going or entering, going into the cell, it normally go through those small holes that are called pores. So, in terms of the place where you would actually have a lot of those nutrients would have been in the digestive system, because that is the system that basically break down and digest the food that you consume, so that you can get the function or get the service of them. So the place of high concentration for those nutrients would actually be in your digestive system. So that is the place where you have a lot of them. And a place of low concentration now will actually be in the cell, for example. So the whole process of diffusion now need to allow these nutrients now to actually enter the cell. Now moving down to the third pointer, they are saying that small molecules such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and glucose, all of these, they are all able to diffuse through the cell membrane. So right away I can ask you another question by asking you to give me a list of things. Give me some substances or chemicals that actually move into the human cells by the process of diffusion. So all of those substances listed there in the third pointer, all of them basically move by the process of diffusion in the human body. Now the fourth pointer, large molecules such as starch and protein cannot. So what they are saying, because these substances, because they are so large, they cannot literally go through those small pores. So when you just consume the food in those large format in terms of starch and protein, them being that large, they cannot diffuse. Those protein, they have to go through the entire digestive system where they will actually be broken down into smaller pieces. So like starch, for example, the end product for starch, that mean after starch go through the digestive system, it normally break down into a simpler form that is called glucose. So glucose is the same thing as starch, you know. It is just that glucose, it is a smaller format of starch, because starch will not be able to go through those small pores because they are too large. So that is why they need to be broken down into some smaller component, and those smaller component are basically the glucose. As for proteins, when protein go through the entire digestive system, protein normally break down into a smaller substance that is known as amino acid. So when you eat a piece of chicken, for example, or you eat a piece of fish, those meat actually contain protein. So in those large form in terms of protein, diffusion will not allow them to enter the cell. So that is why you have the digestive system, which will break down the protein into some smaller particles, and those smaller particles are called amino acid. Now, looking at the image to the bottom now, where you're seeing a cell, so that irregular shape literally represent a cell. So we have diffuse in. So looking now, the blue dots represent oxygen. So if you look on the amount of blue dots, you will realize that there are more blue dots outside of the cell than inside. So that is why the arrow is showing oxygen in. So the fact that there are more blue dots on the outside of the cell, that simply means that the place of higher concentration for the oxygen is outside of the cell. Now looking at the red dots, now the red ones represent carbon dioxide, and you can see the arrow showing diffuse out, and the place of high concentration for the carbon dioxide is actually inside the cell, and that is simply because cells normally produce carbon dioxide. So this carbon dioxide that the cell produce, it basically need to come out of the cell, meaning that it need to leave the cell. And the only process by which it can leave the cell is by that process that is known as diffusion. So the place for high concentration for the carbon dioxide would be in the cell. And if you look at the red dots, you will realize that you have a lot more red dots inside the cell than outside of the cell. So that is why in the place of high concentration for the red dots, that is basically inside the cell. So diffusion will actually cause these two gases to actually exchange, meaning that the cell will now get some oxygen, and it will get rid of the carbon dioxide. Alright, cell membrane is called partially permeable, as it allows only some substances to pass through. So basically, what is this pointer is saying is that this cell membrane that you're seeing in the image, it is saying that it is partially permeable. So first students need to know the definition for partially permeable. When we use the term partially permeable, what we mean? Now it is basically saying that cell membrane only allows some substances to move across, whether leaving the cell or entering the cell. So the cell membrane normally described as being partially permeable. Some textbook will say semi-permeable, which means some, because the word partially means some and the word semi mean some. So you can describe it as being partially permeable or semi-permeable. So like for example, poisonous substances. Now the cell membrane will not allow those, will try as best as possible not to allow those substances to go across. All right, so I'm moving on in terms of heading. So diffusion in the human body. So right now we'll be looking at some examples of this process of diffusion taking place inside of the human body. So after breathing in, so let's say for example you're sitting and you take a deep breath. So they are saying after breathing in, oxygen diffuses into the small blood vessels of the lungs. And the image is showing something that is known as the alveoli, and that is located inside the human respiratory system. So this is where what is known as oxygen or gaseous exchange take place. So the second point is saying carbon, which is carbon dioxide they are talking about, will diffuse from blood vessel to the air sac in the lungs. Now, what is the air sac? The air sac is this diagram that you are looking at, the yellow section, and the air sac is the same thing as the alveoli. So we can change those two, we can use those two terms, whether you're gonna say alveoli or ear sacs. So yeah, persons, you're gonna come across a term, you're gonna come across alveoli and you're gonna come across alveolus. The two of them mean the same thing. It is just that alveoli is whenever you're talking about more than one. So that is the plural, while alveolus is the singular. So the third pointer, digested food also passes from the small intestine into the blood capillaries by diffusion. So from this slide, I can ask you to give me two substances that move from one body part to another by the process of diffusion. And two of those substances would be oxygen, and you can say carbon dioxide, and also the nutrients that will move from your digestive system into the surrounded blood vessel. All right, so concept adaptation that speed up diffusion. So there are some features of the human body in terms of diffusion to take place fast within the human body or within the environment, just about anywhere diffusion is taking place. There are some things that need to exist to actually speed up the rate of diffusion. So diffusion distance um, are short. Now what this means is that the different places in the human body where diffusion is taking place. Let's say for example the oxygen is moving from the respiratory system to the circulatory system. They are saying that these two systems they are very close to each other. So that is why the heading is saying that the distance is short, meaning that it just gonna move from one system to another, and those two systems that are working with each other, they will actually very close to each other. So the substances they don't have to travel a far way. Now I'm gonna use an example. That iron that you use to iron your clothes. If you should plug in that iron and allow it to hot. Now if you should not put just one page, just one sheet out of your book. Just tear one sheet out of your notebook. Put it on the face of the iron and then put your hand on that paper. I'm quite sure that you're gonna get, a whole lot of burn. So that is scenario A. Now for scenario B, you use that same iron, you actually put one very thick textbook. So you actually don't put one entire textbook on the face of the iron, and next you put your hand on the textbook. I'm quite sure that you're not gonna feel as much burn versus whenever you did just use one single sheet. And that is simply because for the single sheet, the distance is shorter from the face of the iron to your hand versus scene B where you use an entire textbook. So the distance will be much longer for the textbook, because remember that the textbook is thick, you know. So when you put the textbook on the face of the iron, next you put your hand on the next side of the textbook, then that distance is much further than the scene where you would use that single page. So all they are saying is that the shorter the distance, the faster the rate of diffusion that will take place. So in the human body, if some nutrients want to leave the digestive system and go to the circulatory system, the circulatory system and the digestive system ensure that the two systems they are close to each other. So when the nutrients need to move from one to the other, you don't have to move over one long distance. Because the longer the distance is, the slower the rate of diffusion will take. Alright, so the next condition that they are saying, or the next adaptation, is that concentration gradients are maintained. So at all moment there should be an imbalance. So concentration gradient again mean that there is a difference between two different regions. So what they are saying, if we are talking about the circulatory system and the digestive system, if let's say for example in terms of glucose, if the same amount of glucose in the digestive system is the same amount in the circulatory system, then you're not going to have diffusion taking place, because there is what is known as equilibrium or equality. But that kind of hard to happen, and that is simply because the glucose that will be in your circulatory system, your circulatory system is constantly taking those glucose to different body parts that need energy. So the fact that your circulatory system is constantly doing that simply means that your circulatory system will always want to get some glucose or some of those nutrients, because as those nutrients enter the circulatory system, they are being transported to other body parts. So there will always be a place of low concentration in terms of glucose within the circulatory system. So how the circulatory system will get some glucose is by the glucose diffusing from the digestive system. So again, in terms of adaptations, so these are some features that normally speed up the rate of diffusion, ensure that diffusion is taking place efficiently. So one, they are saying that the distance is short, and two, they are saying that concentration gradients are maintained. Our next adaptation, diffusion surfaces are large. Now what they are saying is that if diffusion need to take place within a particular body part, that exact part of the body, the system or the body part going to ensure that there's a whole lot of space. There's a whole lot of particles that going to actually take part in that diffusion process. Now, the image that we're seeing is a section of the respiratory system. So the round section that you are seeing represent what is known as the alveoli, which simply means that there is a lot of alveoli inside each lungs. As a matter of fact, the amount of alveoli they said inside the lungs if they should spread out, they can cover entire football field. That is how much inside. So this, simply because you have so much alveoli inside the lungs, then the diffusion surface um, area is large. So the surface where diffusion, or the place where diffusion is taking place, it is large. So the larger the surface where diffusion is taking place, the faster you will be having that process that is known as gaseous exchange taking place, where the human body diffuse oxygen into the blood cells or into the blood vessels and actually diffuse carbon dioxide out. So those three adaptations, all three actually speed up how fast diffusion take place within any particular body. All right, so that should do it in terms of diffusion. So in terms of things that move by diffusion, those things include like particles, it include like gas, it include like scent. So anything you can smell, those normally move by a process that is known as diffusion. So gases and material in terms of things that you can physically touch and gases. Down the next way by which substances enter and leave cells is osmosis. Now, as for osmosis, the explanation, it is very close to diffusion, meaning that the concepts are the same. Where we talk about high concentration and low concentration. Because water, liquid, or fluid, now these substances normally move from point A to point B by the process that is known as osmosis. So diffusion have to do with osmosis also. Diffusion have to do with gas. Diffusion have to do with scent or you smell something. Right, so looking at osmosis now, as you can see, the first pointer is saying that osmosis, it is a special case of diffusion. It is the only difference between diffusion and osmosis is that for osmosis, it basically speak about the movement of water. But as for the concept in terms of place of high concentration and place of low concentration, the concept and explanations are the same. So osmosis involves the movement of water through a partially permeable membrane. And again, they are talking about this that cell membrane. So they say partially permeable. So partially means some. So let's say, for example, you have a lot of water inside the human body, and the cells need some of those water. They are saying that the cells not gonna allow all of the water to enter it, because if all the water should enter the cell, then the cell gonna actually become turgid and burst. Cause so that means, and that is simply because they are getting too much water. So that is why the cell membrane, it is partially permeable, meaning that it select the volume as in the amount of substance or the type of substance it want to leave or enter it the cell there. So the third pointer, this means that only some substances can pass through the membrane, right? Because there is no way the human body can allow everything to just enter the cells of the human body. If that was the case, then by now would have been contracting so much different sicknesses or disease. And of course, if too much water enter the cell, the cell membrane can burst because of what would be that high water pressure there. The last point is small molecules such as water can pass through, but larger molecules cannot. So if you look at the notes for osmosis, it is basically talking about the same thing as diffusion, where you have place of high concentration and place of low concentration. Because looking at the image now. As for the yellow dots, the yellow dots represent oxygen, and you will see more that more red dots is actually on the left side, while on the right side you have five, on the left side you have like about eight. So there's a difference of three. So right there you can say that concentration gradient exists. So it exists. So the fact that you have inequality among the two side there will simply mean that diffusion must take place until they are evenly distributed. All right, students are gonna take a for 2 minutes break, so they're about. All right, so you can take a 2 minutes break from the screen. Yes. Right. So osmosis now. This point I saying that osmosis is water moving from a region where its concentration is high, and that means that in a dilute solution to where its concentration is low, and that means to a more concentrated solution. So once we are talking about the movement of water, so water move in and out of cell by that process that is known as osmosis. Now, a practical example of osmosis taking place is, for example, let's say, for example, you wash some clothes, you hang up the clothes, and midway the process of the clothes being dry, the rain start to fall, and you take up those damp clothes. If you should put those damp clothes on the bed or settee, or you put it on somewhere that is dry. Now, the fact that the clothes is slightly wet simply mean that those drier surface, they will actually eventually get wet. So that simply mean that the water now will be moving from where it is of higher concentration, and that now would be inside of the clothes, to a place where if it is of lower concentration, and that now will be on the bed, for example, which would not contain any water. So the spread or the sheet on the bed that is totally dry, then they will eventually get wet because of osmosis will allow the water to move from the wet clothes to those dry areas. So that's an example of osmosis taking place. Another practical real life situation of osmosis taking place is whenever you're using mop to mop up some water. So let's say, for example, some water spill on the floor or flooding, or just about any in scenario where you're getting up mopping up some water. The fact that you would be using a dry mop, for example, so the mop is dry and the water is on the floor. So on the floor where you have that water, that would be the place of highest concentration for the water on the floor, while the dry mop will be the place of lower concentration for the dry mop. But as soon as you place that mop in the water, then the whole process of osmosis now gonna allow the water to move from the floor and go into the mop. So that is an example of osmosis taking place. Now, if you realize, if it is a lot of water and you're mopping and mopping and you realize that the mop cannot hold any more water, that is simply because equilibrium would have reached. So in order for you to take up some more water with the mop, you know would have to go and wring out the mop. So when you wring out the mop, now you get rid of that excess water in the mop. So the whole concentration gradient gonna actually happen again, where the map will have the least amount in terms of water, while the floor would have the most in terms of water. Alright, so we're looking now at a plant cell in water, or a cell in water. So if you should place or put a cell in water, now in terms of osmosis, the fact that the cell is in water, literally in water, that simply means that outside of the cell would be the highest in terms of water concentration, while inside of the cell will be the lowest. So when you place a cell in water, water will enter the cell by that process that is known as osmosis. And the fact that water will enter the cell mean that that cell is gonna expand inside in terms of size. So the fact that this cell gonna expand in terms of size, something need to control the amount of water. Because if the cell membrane, for example, is not controlling the amount of water that is going into the cell them are going eventually burst, because the water pressure just keep on adding up and adding up and adding up until it bursts. So that is why the cell need what it as a control mechanism that can regulate how much water enter, how much water leave the cell. And the cell membrane has that function where it only allow some amount of water. So the second point, that the cell will become turgid or stiff. So once you place the cell in water and water now start to enter the cell, it will become turgid. Or if you want to use the word stiff. A perfect example is like dry peas, the red peas. Let's say for example you want to cook some red peas. Rather than just throwing the peas in the boiling water, you can make it cook much simpler by you putting the peas in some cold water before you start cook it. So like for example, you're gonna cook it Sunday morning. Like when you get up like 6 o'clock, you soak the peas in the cold water. So let's say for example by 8 o'clock, by 9 o'clock, you're gonna actually cook it. It will now easier because the fact that you would have placed the peas in the water mean that water gonna diffuse into the peas by osmosis. So the peas basically are gonna swell, and the fact that water now enter the peas mean that it's gonna actually suffer in terms of its texture, and the peas are gonna be larger in terms of size because the water are gonna swell it. So the word turgid is basically mean the same thing as stiff. So rather than using stiff, you can use the term turgid. Animal cells will swell up and burst if too much water enter the cell. So as for animal cell, for example, so inside our body, the cell membrane have to ensure at all time that it is working properly. Because if the cell membrane is not working properly, then it will, for example, allow too much water to enter the cell. And if there is too much water entering the cell, then the cell can literally burst. But as for plant cell don't easily burst. And that is simply because plant cell also surrounded by cell wall and not cell membrane only. Right, so the last point, the strong cell wall stop plant cell from bursting when water enters them. So from the notes where you got for cells, you would have noticed that inside animal cell and plant cell there's a component that is known as a vacuole, where in plant cell the vacuole normally large, while in animal cell the vacuole normally small. And that is simple because plant cells need a lot of water, so that is why they need a large vacuole, while animal cell don't need a lot of water because animal don't make their own food. So because the plant knows realize that it's going to need a lot of water, hence the cell is not only surrounded by a cell membrane, it is also surrounded by a cell wall, which will prevent it from bursts. That is whenever a lot of water enter it. Alright, so cell in a concentrated solution. So if you should place the cell in a concentrated solution, that means like salt, sugar. So like persons who eat June plum, or after you peel the June plum, if you put it into a bag that contains salt or sugar, that is an example of you placing the plant cell in that case, because the June plum would be a plant, so it must be plant cell. So that would be a situation where you is actually now placing the cell in a concentrated solution, which is the salt, for example. And persons would now notice that once you place the June plum in salt, because the salt is dry now, and the June plum is water because the June plum contains water. Now, once you do that, then the process of osmosis now gonna start to take place. Because I'm quite sure that after you shake up the bag after a few minutes and you put it down and you notice, then you're gonna actually literally see water in the bag itself. That is simple because the salt would have drawn out some of the water out of the June plum. Because the water normally diffuse or moved by osmosis from a place where there is a lot of water, which would be in the June plum, to a place where there is small or little bit of water, which would be in the salt. So that is osmosis taking place. Now, once you have this taking place, then the cells this time will shrink. The cells, they're not going to get large. They will actually shrink. And the scientific term for shrink here is plasmolyze. That is what they mean. So plasmolyze is the opposite of turgid that you would have looked at on the previous slide. So if you should place the cell in water, it's gonna actually get stiff. And if you should place the cell in concentration, in concentrated solution, then it will actually shrink. So you have to know the difference between those two. All right. So in terms of questions, I have some questions here that I want you to take down and answer them. And once you answer them, then you're gonna submit them to me via WhatsApp. So let me see if I can get it bigger so persons can see it much better. Right, so persons should be able to see the questions. So students, go ahead and get down these questions, answer them, and send them to me via WhatsApp. And please remember to mark your name present in the WhatsApp group, because that's where I will be getting the register from.